But actually, that's a really good segue, I think, into the next topic area. So we'll be looking at ethical research with human subjects in the Northern Plains. And we'll hear from Anita Frederick from the Tribal Nations Research Group. She's the president of the TNRG, that's the IRB for Turtle Mountain Band of Chippewa Indians. And obviously lots of considerations from a Tribal IRB perspective when we're looking at ethical research. Then I'll also provide a ethical considerations around research design. And then we have Dr. David Wilson, who is the director of the Tribal Health Research NIH, will also be presenting on this panel. So we'll each present for 15 minutes or so and leave plenty of time at the end for questions and answers. But and we're a few minutes ahead of schedule, so if we go 15 to 20 minutes each, that would be perfectly fine as well. But Anita, if you're ready, we can go ahead and move on to the next panel. I think you're on mute, Anita.
Okay, are you seeing the presentation or are you seeing a journal article?
No, we can see it. Yeah, it's up.
Okay, so just to go kind of through this, I'll quickly introduce myself. And there's a struggle with dual screen, so I'm gonna shut that off really quick. I had the same problem last night, so so I'm gonna reshare my screen again. Maybe I should have just went with Melissa's plan and had Daddy do it. So just really quickly, I'll introduce myself. I'm Anita Frederick, and as Don said, I'm the president of Tribal Nations Research Group, but I'm also the research director for the Turtle Mountain Band of Chippewa tribe, which TNRG, Tribal Nations Research Group, is actually through tribal resolution charged with oversight for our research review board, which is an interesting relationship, but it works pretty good for us. So we actually have research oversight now. So a little bit about Tribal Nations Research Group. We're a 501c3, we're a nonprofit, and our mission is to promote high quality research relevant to the Turtle Mountain Band of Chippewa Indians. The results will provide custom fit data and data ownership, promote private and public economic development and opportunity, and hopefully uphold a positive image of the tribe. We're funded through various different funding sources, federal, state, private grants, as well as contracts from the TNBCI to do data, like some data analysis and data collection efforts for our community. So today we're just going to kind of go over why is there tribal research review boards, what's the purpose of research review, the different types of regulatory authority in researching and review across the nation, really, what different types of IRBs is there. And then some of the ethical considerations and challenges in the review process. And I'll probably be like Melissa and talk super fast because we tend to do that. So, so why is there research oversight? Well, there's like a historical context to this. There's a lot of research mistrust in tribal communities based on poor research in the past, the government. When people think of research, they think of government, and that the government wants their information. And a lot of it is that they want to, they feel like the government wants to get rid of tribes or those types of things. So we have to do a lot of education and knowledge building in our communities for our elder population, a lot of our tribal leaders. And there's a lot of over-researching. So there's times in tribal communities where we can have 5, studies going on at one time for pregnant moms, or for diabetes patients, or heart patients. And unfortunately, we don't have so many in cancer, and that's an area that really needs to be reviewed in our community. We have a lot of drive-by researchers, so not everybody makes a life commitment like Dr. Best has. He has really definitely made a life commitment to doing research in our community, which is so important to our people and to our community and to other tribal communities. And I know sometimes I'm hard on him and he feels like we don't support him, but we do. It's just my job to be a little hard on people once in a while. And there's been a sincere lack of control throughout tribal nations across the world, across the US. Like, we didn't know what was going on in our communities. There was all of a sudden articles would show up, or there'd be something published in a local newspaper about this research shows, or on the national news, or it would show up in a textbook or in a class, and we would not even know that research happened in our communities. And so it's important that we understand what's happening in our communities and why it's happening. And then also understanding that we have very complex systems as tribes. We have, think of us as a tribe, like a federal government. Every little tribe is like a form of government. And so our leaders, our tribal officials have oversight, and they're responsible for all these complex systems. So those include people, the natural resources, our land, our culture, preserving our medicine, preserving our language, ensuring that everything we do is competent, it's culturally competent, it's culturally appropriate for our communities. So when I talk about oversight and I talk about governance, I talk about tribal sovereignty. And there's several definitions of tribal sovereignty and what that means. This is one that I feel is in like layman's terms, and it really kind of just says it all. So tribal sovereignty is the legal recognition in the US law of the inherent sovereignty of American Indian nations. The law applied to American Indians by the US government is called federal Indian law. Although undermined by various acts, legal decisions, and policy, we still stand today. These laws still are standing today. Indian reservations are recognized as what can be termed nations within. Each has its own government and sovereign powers to make laws, tax, and etc. And most also have their own tribal justice systems, also based upon their inherent powers. So you could see here that it's a complex system, and our tribal sovereignty basically oversees all of these three things: our people, the citizens of our tribe, the people in our communities, the natural resources of our land base, of our community, our land, our water, our air. Each tribe is in a location where they've made do with what was left to them. And a lot of that is like all they have. So like for Turtle Mountain, we don't have a lot of land. We're one of the smallest tribes, land-based tribes in the nation. But we have a water resource, and without that water resource, we wouldn't be able to be where we're at, because we have no other form of water resources without a whole infrastructure change with our state system. And then, that is a whole nother ball game in itself. And then our air, the quality of our air that our community breathes and lives in, that's also an important part of what our tribe has to govern. And then it's our cultural preservation, our language, our medicine, our ceremonies. All of that is so important that we have to really keep all of this in mind as we make decisions with our IRB. We have to ensure that we take all of these in considerations too, because as a research review board, we're taking on that role that we're going to protect this also. And just to kind of talk a little bit more about the complexity of it all, nationwide, there's 574 federally recognized tribes. So, and keeping this all in context, you could see the diversity in research review processes across the nation. So there's also several dozen state recognized tribes, and some have both federal and state recognition. So each tribe's communities, histories, cultures, and law are unique to that tribe. So just because Turtle Mountain reviews research in one way doesn't mean that SWO, System Wapton will, or Standing Rock, or Pine Ridge, or Spirit Lake. Everybody has their own process, and that's a right through sovereignty that they're given, that we've afforded ourselves, that we're able to do. So, and each tribal authority includes protecting and promoting the health and welfare of their citizens, and part of our oversight as a research review board is to ensure that we carry out some of those functions through the review research. So what is the purpose of the tribal research review? So again, it's to express our sovereignty as nations. It's to provide protection of our people. It's to ensure research oversight, so research is done in a good way, in an ethical way, and that we provide this knowledge to our communities. It's also data ownership. So Turtle Mountain has exercised their right to owning data from research, as opposed to researchers coming in and leaving with the research, and then we're left with nothing after a big investment of time and people into that research. It also means cultural preservation. So at Turtle Mountain, we're a little bit unique than other tribes. We actually review all types of research, not just human subjects research. So part of our research code, it basically says that any systemic collection of data. So it may not be human subjects research, it may be data on, well, a good example is, I think at UND, you guys have all heard about them testing the COVID wastewater, the wastewater at University of North Dakota for COVID, for high levels of COVID. That same study, they're wanting to come and do that same study in our community. And they thought they could just come in and do that study, and working with one of the environmental people in the community, they directed them to the research review board, and they said, well, it's not human subjects research. And we said, we realize that, but you're collecting data that's going to inform the general public. So it is part of our oversight, and you need to have an IRB approval to do that. So they said, well, we'll go to the tribal council and get a resolution. And I said, well, good luck with that, because they're going to just send you back to me. You're wasting your time. Just come to us first. And it's also accountability on our part to our people, and accountability as researchers to our people, and also our accountability to the researchers to ensure that you are doing good research in the community. That's that we're helping you learn about research and the research review process and doing research in our communities. And that's when we talk about the ethics training. That's part of that accountability. That's part of helping researchers understand doing research in our communities. And we do this through laws and policies. So we do this through governance, our governance structures, through research codes, and also for some tribes through research agendas. So some tribes will only approve research based on what they say is in their agenda, that they want to know about, and the research that they want to have conducted. So there's 4 different types that we've identified through a publication that some of us worked on, and I don't believe Melissa was on this publication, but she was on a couple other publications that we worked on. But the first type of research review authority is a tribal nation. So that's an entity authorized to provide the ethical review and monitoring of research for one tribal nation or for a single reservation home to more than one tribal nation. And I'll send some article links to Danny in the chat box so people can pull some of these articles down and take a look, because they're two really, there's some really great resources that as a CIRCA team we developed, and it was kind of the end of our big hurrah as CIRCA partners, and kind of our legacy, I think, of all the work that we did as partners. The second authority is sometimes a tribal college. So different tribes have given the authority to their tribal college, has their research oversight, and Sitting Bull is one of those, and you'll hear from him, from a representative from the IRB, from Sitting Bull College this afternoon, and they review all the research for their tribe. And at one point, Spirit Lake was at that point. I don't know where they're at with that process today, but I do know that their tribe requires tribal resolution directly from their tribal government for research approvals. So a tribal college is an entity that provides the ethical review and monitoring of research for a tribal college or university. So then we have tribally based or focused organizations or departments. So some tribes decided that the only part of research that they want to have oversight in is cultural preservation or environmental. They'll let IHS handle taking care of the other oversight, the human subjects oversight, and so they rely heavily on their Indian Health Service, IRB. But a tribally based or focused organization is an entity in an existing organization or department that provides the ethical review and monitoring of research for that organization or department, and is within a tribal nation or nations, and or serving American Indian or Alaska Native people. So there's several in the article. It kind of lists all the different types and the ones that we were aware of and were able to find through research when we were doing the article, when we were actually developing the article. And then the last one is the Indian Health Service, which is an entity designated by IHS to provide the ethical review and monitoring of research conducted in IHS facilities within IHS regional or national designations. So an example is for Turtle Mountain, any research coming out of IHS, the researcher has to get approval from Indian Health Service in addition to receiving our tribal approval. And there's agreements between our regional IHS authority, our regional IRB, and Turtle Mountain's IRB that they won't approve until we approve. And then any amendments that need to take place upon approval, then we would work those out between us with the researcher and the two IRBs. So it's a complex system, but it works. So when we start talking about a little bit of our researchers, they face some unique challenges. We agree, we get that, we really do. And we've tried to work through those challenges, and I see Dr. Pett smiling, and he's like, yeah, you guys have some challenges. You know, but we try to address those challenges, and I know at Turtle Mountain we do. And we try to make it a little simpler on the researcher, but sometimes it just doesn't work. So some of those challenges that researchers face doing research in tribal communities is that each community is completely different. And that's important for researchers to know. They need to know that navigating is different at Turtle Mountain as opposed to Fond du Lac or even Navajo Nation. So across the nation, each community is going to have a different process, but each community will more than likely have a process, you know, real soon. A lot of things have happened that have kind of put the pressure on tribal communities to have a defined process. It may not be as formal as having an actual IRB, but they will have a written process hopefully have a written process in place for research oversight in their communities. And some review different levels and types of research. So as I mentioned earlier, some tribes just want control of human subjects. Some tribes just want cultural preservation review. Some tribes like us do human subjects and any type of data collection efforts that are in the community. Some tribes have formal meeting schedules versus tribal council meetings or committee meetings, those types of things. It's your job to research that and find out what's the process that each tribe is using. Some tribes have a formal application process. Ours is very formal. It's I think pretty simple, but that's me. We have an online submission process, and we try to be very transparent about when things are due and when it'll be reviewed. And some require just a letter of submission. So you may have to submit to your college IRB or your organizational IRB. Some communities just allow you to submit that same application. And again, a unique challenge is locating the designated authority. So even within some tribes, there may be 3 authorities. So there may be a tribal college, there may be a cultural preservation office, and then your final authority may be your actual tribal IRB. But the purpose of those is that everybody all works together. That's what it's all about. It's about developing a relationship with that community. And that's a key aspect in doing research in tribal communities, is to develop relationships. And Dawn, if I get going too long, just tell me, Anita, your time's up.
So you have a couple minutes.
Okay, so the second part of this is the research review board and their unique challenges for the actual review board. So we have challenges too that we have to deal with on a on a day-to-day basis. Some of those is, getting the PI familiar with the tribal community, directing them to the right people, connecting them to the resources that they need in the community, educating the PI on working in tribal communities. And so understanding when we review research, why did the PI select this community? We need to see clear data showing the need for the research and what's the benefit to the community versus what's the benefit to the researcher. And that's a really hard line to navigate sometimes, because we know we want to promote research, but we also have a responsibility to protect our communities. So, how flexible is the PI willing to be? Is there a need to protect the people? But there's a need to protect the people, but also promoting the research and the research process. And just overall developing a sense of trust in the community. So one of my greatest challenges as the director of research for our community has been to build that trust in the community. And I was asked this question last night because we did a COVID survey and we got huge response in like 7 days. We got over like 900 responses in 7 days. And one of the students asked me, how did you get such a huge response when we can't get people to do the census? And I said, it's because I've built a sense of trust in the community. The people know that we will not misuse the data, and that the data we're collecting is going to be used to drive decision making and our own health and welfare in our community. So some of the key considerations to take in, and is that relevancy. Does the community have a research agenda? There's a spelling error there. So that's something to think about. What's the benefits of the research to the community? How often is the target population being researched? And then again, reporting, reporting the data properly and respectively in journal articles. So sometimes it's not always like, this is the negative aspect of it, but this is some of the positives that came from the research, but yet we have this negative. And that's not like normally how we do things in journal articles. That maybe not as as attractive, but it's really important that you work that out with your local IRBs to make sure that we're presenting the data in a way that they agree with and that they see as the best way. So it's really developing a relationship, a sense of trust between everybody. And I think this is my last slide, but data protection. So it's really protecting our traditional systems, allows tribes to protect our most important resources and our people, protecting our medicines, protecting our ceremonial practices, and it allows our tribes to protect our people, lands, and resources. That's why research is important and research oversight and research ethics is important in tribal communities. So is there any questions? Or do you want to wait till the very end, Don?
That was just excellent. Yeah, maybe what we could do is have the three panelists speak and then have time at the end for questions, and maybe questions might overlap to all of the speakers potentially. And if you do have questions, please put them in the chat so we can even prepare for those as well. But thank you so much, Anita. That was just outstanding. And I think that what is happening at Turtle Mountain with Tribal Nations Research Group really is a model program that I think could be utilized in other communities. And just very briefly, I know one of the big advantages that you have with your IRB is you have so many community members, highly educated community members that are on the IRB and leading it. They have their own experience in research. So thanks so much for sharing, and I'm sure we'll have questions from the attendees today. So let me go ahead and share my screen, and I'll go ahead and get started with my presentation. So I'll look at this from a perspective of research design. So I think I know just about everyone on the call, but for those who I don't know, I'm Donald Warren. I'm Oglala Lakota, originally from Kyle, South Dakota, on the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation. I'm on faculty at University of North Dakota School of Medicine and Health Sciences, where I serve as Associate Dean of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. I'm also Director of the Indians into Medicine, or INMED program, and Director of the Public Health program. And as I had mentioned at the very beginning, we have a brand new PhD in Indigenous health that I'm very proud of, and very happy that it's moving forward. I think it's something that's long overdue. In my own experience, I have my MD from Stanford, my MPH from Harvard, and I've been on faculty at 3 research universities, Arizona State University, North Dakota State University, and University of North Dakota. And I also worked as a staff clinician for NIH. So I actually did diabetes research in the intramural research program. So I was actually hired by NIH to work with them. And I also served on their IRB. So the NIDDK, that's the National Institute of Diabetes and Digestive and Kidney Disorders. That's the branch that I worked for. And I was served on their IRB. I was on the Arizona State University IRB, even during the Havasupai issue, which maybe we can discuss later. And I've also been on the National Indian Health Service IRB. But for my entire life, I've been Oglala Lakota. You know, that's who I am originally, and that's who the basis of my life. So I come at this from multiple different perspectives, really understanding the cultural issues, the sovereignty issues, but also the scientific side and faculty researcher side. So I'll look at these issues from those perspectives. And we have to recognize that health data and health research is a key component of the health system. We need good data, and we need the data to inform policymaking and advocacy. And that's where we can have good policies and programs as well as funding. So we have to have advocacy for funding. We need the funding for programs and services to improve population health, and then to continue to collect the data. So it really is a circular process. And if we don't have good data and good research, we're really at a disadvantage when we're trying to inform policymakers and advocate for the health needs of our populations. So when we think about research design considerations, just like Anita said, one of the first steps is building those relationships. So we can't just assume that the community is a laboratory. You know, we have to look at this as people. It's the human relationships that are so vitally important to success. And also, who is setting the research priorities and the research agendas? And it's wonderful to see more tribes moving forward with establishing their own research agendas. And that's something I'd love to see expand here in the Northern Plains. There's also issues related to data management and ownership. And we're very fortunate to have Dr. David Wilson, who will be presenting after me, talking from the NIH perspective. And there's been great advances in terms of understanding tribal sovereignty and data ownership in that relationship between the funding agency and the communities. So there's all kinds of implications for conducting research with tribal communities, and Anita went through many of them, and it's so vitally important to recognize the role of tribal sovereignty. But in my own experience, when I talk about research with tribal leaders, whether it was in Arizona or here in the DaCotas, I've heard people tell me, oh, research is a dirty word in Indian country, or research is a four-letter word in Indian country. But again, I think if without good data and research, we're missing a key component of the health system. So we have to have good community engagement. And when we're talking about community engagement, of course, tribal leaders are a key component of that, elected officials, but we have a lot of informal leaders that have a significant impact on decision-making and behavior in the communities. And each community is different. As Anita mentioned, there's over 570 federally recognized tribes, and each is its own sovereign entity and has its own dynamics. So we have to engage the community to really understand who the leaders are, both formal and informal leaders, and who are the stakeholder groups we need to engage. We have elder groups, tribal health programs, tribal colleges, traditional healers, other informal community leaders and cultural leaders, and then the local health professionals and the IHS tribal and urban Indian health programs as well. So when I think about the communication strategies, I really love this image. This is a picture of Chief Red Cloud and one of the federal agents that they were working with during the land negotiations for the reservations and the treaties. And there's so much symbolism built into this picture. And you know, the cultures are different, the languages are different, the experiences are different. And when I think of this as a community member who's going to be studied, and then also thinking about a well-trained scientific researcher, can there be miscommunication or misunderstandings? And obviously there can be when we look across those dynamics. So when we think about the relationship, ideally, we would also have more community members serving as principal investigators. And that's got to be one of our goals. And historically, we've had some very good researchers. Some are on this call today. Dr. Bess has done a remarkable job with genuine community immersion and community engagement. But we've had examples where that was not the case. So again, the more we can do to build our own capacities as researchers, the better. So who owns the data? Who owns the samples? And NIH policy historically was that NIH owns everything because it's federal money, but there's been much more recognition through the Tribal Health Research Office for the need to have better data sharing agreements and understandings and recognizing and respecting tribal sovereignty. We also mentioned a little bit earlier about the data sets. There's so many data sets, and it's not the same groupings of people within each data set. We have to keep that in mind. That Indian Health Service has what's called the Resource and Patient Management System. That's the data set that has a lot of data, but not all American Indians are captured in the IHS data. We have separate tribal data sets, and tribes understandably may or may not be willing to share data, so we have to have good data sharing agreements and protections. There's statewide data sets, federal data sets through CDC and otherwise. So we have to recognize there's all kinds of complexities when we're looking at this. And then in terms of research collaboration, we also have to recognize that the collaborators have different worldviews, different perspectives. A tribal indigenous worldview and perspective might be very different than a researcher scientist perspective. And the funding agencies have different perspectives as well. So fortunately, over the last 25 years or so, there's been some good movement to try to build the relationships in a more positive way. In the 1990s, out of the University of New Mexico, there was a model tribal research code that was developed. That's available online if anyone's interested. But that's a really good starting point. Also, tribal consultation processes, and there's now, as of the last 15 to 20 years, a Health Research Advisory Committee, or the HRAC, out of Office of Minority Health. But we still need more American Indian Alaska Native researchers, but we are fortunately moving in that direction. So another consideration is culture, and what is culture? So there's multiple definitions, but here's one. It's the whole, complex, distinctive spiritual, material, intellectual, and emotional features that characterize a society or a group. So it's a very holistic perspective on what culture is within a community. So does research have a culture? Does it have its own language, its own belief systems, its own history, its own priorities, its own values? And I would put forth, yes, research in many ways is a culture. So we have to look at cross-cultural connectedness in a meaningful way. And cultures change over time. And I think what we're seeing is a cultural shift at NIH and at universities starting to recognize the need for better community engagement and cultural relevance. So we used to use the term cultural competence a lot. That's still a commonly used terminology. And we're starting to move away from that. But about 20 years ago, in 2002, Papadopoulos and Lees published an article looking at different levels or prerequisites of cultural competence, looking at cultural awareness, at least being aware that there's cultural differences, cultural knowledge, and understanding other cultures' perspectives, and cultural sensitivity and being sensitive to those differences. We're moving beyond that in terms that cultural safety and cultural humility are really gaining a lot of importance and recognition as higher levels of how we interact across cultures. And I love the idea of cultural humility. And part of that is to evaluate one's own values and perceptions. And I'd put forth that universities need to do this. You know, we have to have our own values clarifications. Researchers and scientists need to do this as well. And it really is critical to promoting respectful research. We have to understand where we are coming from in our own perspective as scientists and as researchers and as universities, if we're going to have genuine connectivity to the populations that need answers, that need to have health equity promoted. One of the challenges is that in higher education, we're taught to be very assertive. You know, we have to be assertive to be successful in academic settings. But if we take that assertive nature into tribal communities, we will never be successful in engagement. So it's very complex, and it requires a great deal of cultural awareness and values clarification that I think does not frequently happen at this level. So pleased to see our ethics and other programs moving forward. So in terms of cultural humility in research, it has to be at the researcher level, the agency level, the university level. Even how we design, research, collect data, and report the data has to be done in a culturally humble way. So our historic paradigm, we had the research institution like a university, funding agency like NIH and others, and we use some sort of laboratory setting to obtain results. And historically, the community was treated as a laboratory from which data are gathered. And that's not a good way to approach it, obviously. What we want is results in terms of publications, results in terms of scientific outcomes, but we also want benefit to the community. So we might define results differently, but we can see that they don't have to be mutually exclusive. We can have good science, good publications, and community benefit. And that really is why we need this CBPR paradigm. And I won't go into great detail regarding the history of CBPR. I know many of you are quite aware of this, but here at UND, we of course have the DaCCoTA program. It's the DaCCoTA Cancer Collaborative Translational Activity, and we're changing that. Moving forward, it will be the DaCCoTA Community Collaborative on Translational Activity, looking at translational research and the need to translate research into findings that actually have community benefit. We also have proposed an Indigenous Trauma and Resilience Research Center, and we actually presented this to Tribal Nations Research Group several months ago, and all of the tribes in our region to get approval, because trauma, unresolved trauma, adverse childhood experiences, historical trauma have been identified as key factors that are leading to health inequities, and we need to get a better understanding of that. So that's part of what we're trying to do here. So CBPR really has become kind of the ethical gold standard, but even beyond CBPR, it's more than just community-based participation. We have to look at how the research agenda is set itself, and we need to have more community member researchers involved in the process. So what we're moving forward is tribally driven research framework. So it's above just community participation, but tribally driven. It has to be specific to tribal communities, and it could address things that maybe historically were not the priorities of the research community or the scientific community, because I think that if you don't have the lived experience of indigeneity and the lived experience of marginalization and the impacts of colonization, perhaps you don't recognize the importance of these things. But for our own communities, I think we see the challenges related to trauma. And that's why many of the tribes are looking at this as a real priority for better understanding. So mechanisms of tribally driven research include tribal oversight, tribal priorities, use of facilitators where we can have things like the Our Ethics program to help research community understand the populations being studied, but also facilitators to build the research capacities within the communities. And then, of course, training and employing community members and having more culturally specific methodologies. So that's where we're moving, is in the tribally driven research framework arena. And I'll go ahead and stop there because I'm very excited to introduce my good friend and colleague, Dr. David Wilson. Dave is a member of the Navajo Nation from Arizona, and he and I are both proud graduates of Arizona State University. So Dave, in honor of that, I'm wearing my ASU Sun Devil shirt today. But
fantastic.
Dave, yeah, Director of the Tribal Health Research Office, and just thank you so much for being a part of this. I'll go ahead and hand it over to you.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Warren. It's a pleasure to be here. It's great to see so many people listening into this conversation. Very important one. So I'm going to share my screen now. And what I'm going to try to do is that Anita and Don really provided some terrific information to help set the stage. I'm going to ask everybody to pull way back and kind of look at this at the 10,000-foot level about how we're trying to change an agency's culture and how they work with tribal communities. So here you can see on my screen the NIH Tribal Health Research Office. And one of the very first things that we did is try to figure out how we imagined our work within the agency. And we were able to, I think, capture this through our logo here, which is a dream catcher with all the different institutes and centers that surround the Thoreau office. And that's actually what we do, is we coordinate tribal health research across the entire agency. And so this was, I think, one of the fundamental steps when people began thinking about how do we work with tribes, or who do we go to who has the expertise in working with tribes. That's our office. And so this is our start, and then I will talk about how we're beginning to set the stage within this particular agency. So actually, I should go back. I hope that many of you, Dr. Warren had talked about the NIH. The NIH is the largest funder of biomedical research in the world. So last year, we funded $43 billion in biomedical research, and it's going to be, I think, even more this year because of our really critical focus on addressing COVID-19, and not just in the general population, but specifically in tribal communities. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later in my presentation. But the NIH is really an interesting place because it is all about having that persona about being better than the next researcher, having more publications. And this is one of the things that we're really trying to communicate to the scientific community and the NIH community at the same time, is that it's really important to take into consideration all of these other things that had been mentioned by Anita and by Dr. Warren, because those are critical in continuing research. You can enter a tribal community and have a terrific amount of publications, but if you do that, you risk being a one-shot opportunity and destroying your relationship with the community, and you'll never be invited back, to help serve the community. So getting back to what our office does is one of the most, I think one of the critical things that we've done that the agency has never had is a strategic plan, a trans-NIH strategic plan on how to address tribal health research. And so without a roadmap, a lot of the institutes and centers, they were kind of doing their own thing, and there was never any real coordinated effort to work in tribal communities. So here you can see the 4 pillars of our strategic plan. Communication and collaboration. Okay, enough said on that point. That's just absolutely critical. But some of the things that we try to do through research is build research capacity within our communities. Again, we want to have more AIAN researchers be able to do the work that they want to in their own communities. Expanding research. You know, this is something that's critically important. Is there enough behavioral health research occurring in your community? Is there enough substance misuse research going on to help address, you know, the rising issues, especially related to isolation and COVID-19 in your communities? But also, I think what's the most important thing is in the black here is the cultural competency and community engagement. So Don, I'm sorry to say that the federal agency is still using that term. That's the only term that they recognize yet, but we'll begin the transition soon. But this is really important, because if you don't do the work in this manner, then everything else is jeopardized, and it will be less effective, I think, overall, if you don't have that tie into the culture and that have that connection with the community. That's critically important. So, and what you see out of all of this, I think, is important to take away, is that now our office is beginning to promote a more holistic approach to engaging communities in research, and I think that's critical. It's no longer the linear approach, you know, the deconstructing of a disease to hopefully identify a single gene that will be the end all meets all for addressing health. That will never happen. It is going to take the research that encompasses community, environment, behavior. All of these things are critically important in improving the health within our communities. So related to the conversation around tribal IRBs, which was so critically important, is that Anita brought up, you know, tribal sovereignty, and that's something that our office takes. It's a fundamental keystone of what we have to be aware of and cognizant of in conducting not only biomedical research, but all different forms of research, is tribal sovereignty. And she talked about how this pertains to people, natural resources, and cultural preservation. Well, in the context that I have here is in the context of people, human subject protections. And this is one of the, I think, major and fundamental responsibilities of tribal IRBs, is how do they ensure that the research that is being proposed for a community is safe, but is also making sure that it doesn't promote or perpetuate stereotypes in our communities. And that's also critically important. And what's the benefit to the communities? So federal law here is 45 CFR 46, which is mostly known as the Common Rule. And many of you have probably heard about this. The Common Rule was established in 1991. It was amended in 2005. And just recently, they came out with the final rule to the Common Rule. Well, the final rule to the Common Rule was put out just a year after I assumed my role as the first director of the office, Tribal Health Research Office. And the things that I have here, the 3 bullets that I have, are undoubtedly extremely important for research, but they are not supportive, or they're not recognizing issues that remain in tribal communities. And so these are things that we have to really continue to work around, which is really, really important. Something that I think has been problematic that we're continuing to address, and we've been able to modify policies to make sure that tribal communities understand, not tribal communities, but researchers understand here, is that the single IRB rule, which means that if there's multiple research projects that are going to happen in different areas, that all you need to do is to get a single IRB approval, and then that applies to all the different sites that are in question here. That doesn't apply to tribal communities. It can't apply to tribal communities, because as Anita had talked about, each community is so different. The processes are different. The priorities are different. And so that all has to be taken into consideration when thinking about research. Something else that's highly problematic that we're continuing to work with is the use of broad consent. And broad consent means that we can propose a research project right now, but not really have all the different analytical processes that would be included in this effort. And we may think about more things now. We may think about more things 10 years from now. We may think about more things 20 years from now. But if you consent now, then your samples and your data is open to these different methodologies from here looking forward. And that's really problematic because we don't know what the future holds. And there are several research programs, large research programs at the NIH that have really leaned on broad consent because they can be useful for the general population. But many of the people in the general population don't have the history of research that our communities do. So it's really important to think about when is it appropriate to use broad consent, and it's not with tribal communities. So how do we work around these things, and what is our office doing to address a lot of these issues? Oops, a slide was put in the wrong place. There we go. So what our office does is we hold government to government formal consultation on all these different things. And you know, a lot of the policies that have been established, it's okay. We can go back and revisit those policies to see if they accommodate tribes and are in the best interest of tribes to help facilitate biomedical research in these communities. So last year was a very busy year for us. In 2019, we actually helped and supported 3 consultations. 2 of them we directly facilitated, which was one on intellectual property rights. A lot of communities are interested. How do I protect our interests? You know, if people come into our communities and identify either a traditional medicine or a specific botanical that grows in our region, how do we protect that knowledge and make sure that it stays within our community? A lot of the tribal leaders that we spoke with said that their biggest fear is that researchers would come into our community, identify a highly effective substance from a plant or from a practice, and then it would become commercialized and become so expensive that we couldn't afford it in our own communities anymore. So we're really looking on how to protect the interest and the rights of tribal communities. Another really important consultation that we had was on data sharing and data management. This was brought up earlier, how critically important this is. How do tribes manage and own their own data? And how is that recognized in the context of the broader scientific community? So it's through these consultations where we heard from a lot of not only tribal leaders, but tribal IRBs and consortiums like NCAI, NIHB, who actually work in the interest of tribal communities, that sent in recommendations about what this policy should look like to respect tribal wishes and tribal sovereignty around their ability to retain their own data moving forward. So this policy has actually just come out earlier this summer in draft review, and we're continuing to work with our NIH Tribal Advisory Committee on what are all the different intricacies that would be applied to tribal research as this policy continues to move down a full implementation and promulgation. So a really important part of the work that we're doing in the office. Now, in terms of, Anita really covered this extremely well. But with us at the NIH, you know, some of the things that we have to think about is, and something that we have to continue to promote to our grantees, are that you have to be very aware of the research approval process within tribal communities. Now we're getting to a point where a lot of the institutes and centers will specifically ask grantees who are looking to conduct research within tribal communities, have you received a resolution, or have you received a letter of support within these communities, from these communities, to conduct research with them? You know, we always emphasize that it's with them, it's not to them or for them, it's with them. And here you can see that these are all different parts. We have the Tribal IRB, we have the executive office of a lot of these communities, tribal council, communities, and some of these, I put this in the wheel diagram because the wheel goes in different directions depending upon which communities you work with. And that was brought up earlier. Some of the communities that we work with, they don't have the infrastructure or capacity to support their own IRBs, so then they default to the national IHS IRB for the review on their applications, or they convene special committees to help review these applications and lean on the expert advice of the people that they appoint to these special committees to provide guidance on if these proposals are supportive, respectful, and will be effective, and make sure they have all the appropriate parts in place for this research project to move forward. Traditional healers is also a really important part. You know, some of the things that we've heard from is that a lot of the research that is presented into the communities It may be supported by the elected leadership, but elected leadership cycle in and out. And tribal and traditional healers are always there. They're always members of the community. So it's really important to listen to what are some of their concerns about some of their health issues in the communities from this trusted, critically important group of community members when thinking about research. So I wanted to talk a little bit higher level about how we work at the NIH, and this is something that's affecting all of us right now, is COVID-19. And all of you have heard about Operation Warp Speed, and this is the huge effort that was put together by the administration that has DOD, USDA, DOE, NIH, FDA. But a part of this, drilling down to this, the NIH has created something called the CoVPN, the Coronavirus Prevention Network, which is a conglomeration of all the expertise of all the different networks that they have built up over the years to address specific conditions, HIV, AIDS, infectious disease networks, clinical trial consortiums across the entire world. They are all working together to help provide information on how we address this issue in different communities. They have also convened expert panels, which are AIN expert panels, and they're providing research protocols to us that we can provide to tribal nations. So here you can see the green box, tribal nations. A lot of communities have been reaching out, very interested about research, but they have all of the same concerns that you've heard over the conversation today. What's going to happen with the data? Is the vaccine going to be safe? What's what's the schedule look like? Will we be able to have access to early vaccines if they're approved effective? So all of these things have been brought up, and what we're doing is serving as the clearest form of communication to tribal nations about how they can participate in these trials and why it's critically important for them to participate. There's a lot of research that has happened over the years that has not included tribal communities, and it has been at the detriment of our communities. Take, for example, warfarin. Warfarin is a drug that is a blood thinner. Well, come to find out that tribal members of tribal nations are actually highly sensitized to this compound compared to the Caucasian population. That was not known because we didn't participate in the clinical trials when this drug was developed. Who's to say that the vaccines that are being developed are going to be effective in our communities? And which ones are going to be effective? Are the mRNA vaccines going to be more effective for younger populations, for older populations? This is really important for us to consider. But we are really trying to do this in a very respectful way. Our ultimate goal here is the blue bubble, is to allow the tribes to exercise their tribal sovereignty and make the decision on whether they choose to participate or not. That is our ultimate goal. Our ultimate goal is not to get them into clinical trials. Our ultimate goal is to allow them to make that decision. And however that comes about, so be it. We will provide them as much information as possible, but again, our goal is not to push them into clinical trials. It's to allow them to exercise their sovereignty and make that decision. And when they do that, we fully support that, because we don't believe that they have ever had that opportunity, utilizing and respecting all of their checks and balances to protect their communities all along the way. And it's really important because a couple of weeks ago we had a town hall with Dr. Fauci and President Nez of the Navajo Nation, and this was a Facebook Live event where there was a tremendous amount of fear that was voiced, and a lot of that fear was voiced just because there hasn't been enough communication about what these clinical trials entail. But not only that, what's the benefit to tribal citizens? And we haven't had enough AIN researchers be able to clearly delineate what is the molecular process behind these vaccines and how do they work in our bodies? Because there's so many conspiracy theories out there. Our communities are going to be left behind if we're not able to help our communities support research, get involved in research, and also be tribally driven research. So with that, I will stop, and I will encourage all of you all to visit our website. Here you can see all the different, our email addresses and our Facebook account. We're hoping to launch a LinkedIn account very soon. So again, I appreciate the opportunity to share some of how we work with tribal IRBs in terms of research. So thank you, and I'll turn it back over to Dr. Warren.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wilson. That was outstanding. And also, Anita, I really appreciate all of the wisdom that you shared with us as well. So let's go ahead and open it up to questions, either in the chat or raise your hand, or go ahead and just speak up if you have any questions for any of the three panelists.
Except Lyle. Yeah, for many of you that don't know, Dr. Best has been just an outstanding technical advisor on our NIH Tribal Advisory Committee for many, many years. So it's great to see him.
Yeah.
Well, I'll go ahead. I don't see any hands right now. I have one question, and this is for any of our panelists today. You know, I typically think of things from the viewpoint of the DaCCoTA and how can we not only help potential applicants and potential researchers build those relationships with communities going forward, but what can we improve upon? So I don't know how familiar any of you are with the DaCCoTA and our mechanisms, and that's okay, but maybe more broadly, what's the biggest gap that you see? You know, what comes to your desk every day and you're like, oh, this again, really? Haven't we had this conversation before? So what can we potentially do to help maybe bridge some of those gaps? Is it education? Is it training? Is it, what are your thoughts?
Well, I could share that, yeah, certainly misunderstandings of how to best engage tribal communities from researchers. It's not necessarily, you know, anyone's fault as much as it is. This type of training has not been a part of research training at university levels really for very long. So I think that's an area that needs to improve, is making sure that researchers understand the dynamics of engaging tribes. But Dr. Wilson, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's what we've seen that works most effective is engaging with either the councils or with leadership and just sitting down and having a discussion, not only to build trust and form a relationship, but also ask them what do they want us to address, as opposed to us telling them what we want to bring into the communities. And I think that that's critically important, because we all know what are the 5 top CDC, you know, morbidity, mortality issues within tribal communities, but the ranking of those will differ in different communities. And I think it's important to hear that, recognize that, and respect that.
Very good. And I'd love to hear from Anita as well, your thoughts on that.
So from a perspective of a reviewer, or somebody that oversees that in a tribal IRB, one of the things that comes across our desk often is using data to justify the research that isn't relevant to our community. That's a big, that we see that a lot. So they say a researcher will come into the community and apply for research approval, and the data is maybe at North Dakota level or Rolette County level, and they haven't broken that down to how it's specific to our tribal community. And now we realize that that data is now not always available, but there is some that's really apparent that is available, and that they haven't done their homework in justifying the need for the research. Another piece of this is also for the DaCCoTA team is to understand that not just being Native doesn't make you qualified to be doing research in tribal communities. That's a big issue that we deal with a lot of times. Like I said, like Dr. Best has been working in our community for several years, and you know, as long as I can remember him being a doctor here, and probably young, and he was our medical doctor, and always taking part in some type of research during that whole time. But what's important, he understands the community and has taken time to be like sensitive to that and acknowledge that community, where we have researchers that are from our own community who don't take the time to learn the importance, you know, the cultural values, the cultural norms, the approval procedure. So you really have to keep that in mind as somebody who participates in research and approves research funding for tribal communities. So
great, thank you. I see that Shanadine has raised her hand, so I'll let her go ahead and ask her question here. I will also mention that I'll have Arun put a link to the Qualtrics survey for each and all the sessions in the chat. So if you wouldn't mind participating in that at any point today, I'd be grateful. Shanadine, and I hope I'm saying that right, and please go ahead.
Okay, so my first question is about how to use this. How do I type in the chat box? Because I've been trying to figure that out and I see no option to do that. So I'm just trying to learn.
Sure, yeah, you should be able to just click the chat button and then it'll say to everyone, and then you should be able to type, and if not, I will have to investigate.
Like, okay, I'll just ask my question because maybe that's how you want me to do this. Is that the way you want me to do this? Or?
I think that would work, yeah, if that's okay.
Okay, yeah, it's just that the technology here is, I see no chat button. I see raise hand, yes, no, go slower, faster. That's about it. Okay, anyway, I just wanted to let you know that, because if you're asking for questions and nobody can type them, it's impossible to ask them. So
I appreciate that. We'll have to look into it.
Yeah, I don't know if it's because it's on Facebook or what, but anyway, getting to my question. So I've done a lot of preliminary thought about this, and I've talked to a few different people about this, like doing IRBs on the reservations. And so far it's been a lot of finger pointing and not returned emails. So my question is more, how do I actually talk to these people? Because I have ideas, I have drafts, I have plans, and then it's a dead end at the end. And I don't know, like I've even gone to tribes and visited them and said, I'm here, let's talk about this. And I just don't know what, I think it's the communication piece somehow is really tough. And I kind of want a discussion on that process a little bit. Like, am I just supposed to stalk these people and be like, you know, hey, I sent you this 20 times and I'm calling you, and like, what's the process there? Is there any sort of communication help or way to go through that process? Because right now I've probably spent a solid 2 years trying to communicate with people and it's just kind of not done anything.
I'd say, you know, each community is so different. So the processes for appropriate communication would be variable. But again, I really think the Tribal Nations Research Group is kind of a model program for how to conduct this. So Anita, any thoughts on that? Or what is the process for engaging the IRB at Turtle Mountain?
So normally what, well, we have a website and then there's a link on our tribal website. So a place would be to start first with your tribal government's website to see if they have any place indicating on there that they have a research oversight committee. And if they do, then get directed to that committee. The second piece would be if there isn't a designated oversight within that tribal government website, our you know, contact person is to, normally I would say like contact the secretary of the tribal council to see who they would speak to about research and research that you want to conduct in the community. Most often that leader will direct you to the place that it needs to go to. Sometimes people just don't want to do research and maybe don't want to develop that relationship, but don't have a formal process of saying no to you because they may not understand it. So for us, it would be just directing a question to me on our website, saying, I'd like to do this research, who would I get connected with? And we would connect you to the right people. But again, our process is fairly efficient, and you know, I think it is, others might not think so, but I guess it's really just navigating and doing your own research in the community that you want to work in.
Sorry, who is this person that said I, and for what tribe is this for?
I'm Anita Frederick, and I'm from the Turtle Mountain Band of Chippewa, and we're the research review board for I oversee the research review board for our tribe.
Ah, okay. So you're saying that's what happened for your tribe specifically, or are you speaking for NIH in general? I'm not sure.
I don't speak for NIH. Dr. Wilson's on the call. He could speak in the form of NIH. I guess I thought you were directing your question to a tribe.
Okay.
Is it to a tribe or is it to NIH?
Yeah, well, it's both. I mean, I think it's both because, I mean, I've talked with Dave before. Hi, Dave. Nice to hear from you again. Hope things are going well. But there is a sort of back and forth that does have to happen, like we were discussing before. And so I guess it's understanding also how to communicate between the groups as well, and like what orders make sense. So who needs to communicate when to who, and like it's just hard to know because I don't know who to go to with what information sometimes as well. And so that's what I mean. Like it's just there's no clear communication pathway, and for me, I've just felt like people have pushed me around to different people, and they're like, talk to this person, and I try to talk to them, and then they're like, go talk to this person, and I talk to them, and it just feels like it's very circular. Like there's no conclusion to it at this point. And okay, I don't know if we're still in that phase where things are still not able to be at the point where we make decisions, and that's what I need to hear, or if it's that I'm just not communicating to the right people. So that's kind of my current, I don't know how to read it is what I'm saying. And
okay, so I don't know if you're referring to a specific tribe, our tribal nation, or just in tribes in general. And Dave may be able to give a little bit more insight on your predicament.
Yeah, that's what that was my original question, was just, I just wanted to touch base with Dave through the chat box and say, hey, can I email you to see what the new updates are since I last talked to him a few years ago? So, and then give him a report out on what I tried, but I couldn't talk in the chat box, so I had no idea how to do it. So here I am.
Let's do that, Shanadine. Yeah, why don't you reach out to me and we'll set up some time to chat. I'd be happy to help you.
Yeah, okay, great, thanks. Because I've done a lot of stuff and I just sort of got to dead end and then left it alone because nothing moved forward. Thank you. You can mute me if you want. I think that's all really I wanted to ask.
Okay, great. Well, thank you. So I guess we have time for one more question. And Dr. Westcott, if you don't mind, I believe our Charette has their hand raised. So we'll go ahead with that question and then just wrap it up.
Hi, my name is Reno Charette, and I work for AHEC, and I'm running an NIH grant to train tribal college students to pursue careers in biomedical and behavioral health research. So some of this IRB business is very new to me. I come out of a state higher ed system and now working for AHEC. So I have a question about how our tribes engaged in data management. What is involved in that, and what securities are used for that data?
So from the NIH perspective, yeah, that's a very good question. It is very different and dependent upon the different types of research. So if it's human subject protections research, then there's a lot of different layers that communities request to protect the data and the confidentiality of the participants. But if it's non-human subject data, then the storage and how that's handled is very different.
And I would say our ethics training is also a great place to start for a lot of those principles as well. So Reno, great to hear from you. This is Dr. Warren. Appreciate you joining the call. But I think that our ethics training would be a really good starting point, especially for the students.
Yeah, we have that in our learning platform right now, and I'm just hoping for a moment that I could actually take some of the classes our students are taking.
Well, very good. I know we're just a little bit over time and want to leave plenty of time for our next presenter. But before we move on, let's please thank Anita Frederick and Dave Wilson for sharing their knowledge and information with us. And we're very fortunate to have a tribal health research office at NIH. We didn't have that when I worked for NIH, and I've seen steps in the right direction. It's just wonderful. And having Anita and the Tribal Nations Research Group team here in North Dakota is just another wonderful asset. So things are moving forward in a really good direction. So our next